Hi, and thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC here in New York City. Few housekeeping items before we get started today. The TN visa is one of the most popular visas that our firm handles, and there is good reason for that. If you're a national of Mexico or Canada, there really are fewer. It really is hard to find a better visa option that is more streamlined, that is quicker, and that requires less documentation. The TN really is a quite streamlined and simple option for those who are nationals of Canada or Mexico who are looking to come to the US to work. Our firm does focus on business immigration, though we do handle the full spectrum of immigration law, whether that's family-based temporary visas like student visas or visitor visas. And one thing that I think does set our firm apart is that our founder, Ian Scott, has personally navigated the process, a TN visa, as well as an H-1B, a student visa, F-1 visa, and currently an E-2 visa. So our firm was actually founded on an E-2 visa. And that experience of navigating the process really does inform how we work with our clients. Um, After today's presentation, you are going to be getting an email that includes the presentation that you see on your screen now, as well as a link where you can sign up for future webinars. Again, those do cover the full spectrum of US immigration. We'll also send you a link to our YouTube channel. We put both the full-length webinars on our YouTube channel as well as shorter videos. And again, those do run the full spectrum of US immigration law, not just business immigration. So we hope you'll take a few minutes to check those out, sign up for future webinars, and of course, reach out to us for a consultation if it would be helpful to have a further discussion on your goals, your circumstances. We'd be happy to talk with you. If you have a question during this presentation, feel free to send it in through either the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function on Zoom. I do plan to get through all questions by the end of the presentation, but I may save questions for the end, but feel free to send in any questions as you think of them. So as I mentioned, this presentation is being recorded, and again, we will be posting the full length webinar to our YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in to the TN visa requirements. So as I mentioned before, the TN visa is a visa that's available for nationals of Canada or Mexico. It was created originally through NAFTA. And when I say you need to be a national of Canada or Mexico, that doesn't mean that you need to have been born there. You only need to hold a passport from Canada or Mexico. So if you were born in India, for example, and you have since naturalized and are a Canadian citizen, as long as you have that Canadian passport, you are eligible for a TN visa. And similarly for those who have a passport from Mexico. You must be coming to the United States to work in a specific profession. So to figure out what professions are included, it's helpful if you're at your computer to Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations, and to pull up those regulations. It's 8 CFR 214.6. And as you scroll down, you will actually see a list of somewhere around 80 or so professions, dozens of professions, starting with accountants, then architects, computer systems analysts, continuing to veterinarians, zoologists, and university professors. So there are dozens of professions. So even though there are dozens of professions, there are certain professions that are not listed. So if the job you're looking to come to the US to perform is not listed on this list, then unfortunately a TN visa is probably not going to be a good option for you. You may need to consider an H-1B, an O-1, another visa option. But if your profession is listed on this list, then the TN may very well be a great option for you. So you need to be coming to the US to perform one of these professions, and you must have the required qualifications for that specific profession. And when I say you need the qualifications for that profession. I'm not talking about what the employer wants to see. I'm talking about qualifications that are defined in the regulations. So if we look, let's just take accountant as an example because it's the first on the list. To qualify as an accountant, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license. So those are the two possible ways to qualify as an accountant. You cannot qualify based on experience. Let's say you've been an accountant for 20 years, but you don't have an undergraduate degree in accounting and you don't have a professional license. You would not qualify as an accountant. The qualifications do differ though, depending on the profession. So if we look at economist, we see that you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So a accountant, you can qualify based on an undergraduate degree or a professional license. Economist, you must have a degree, an undergraduate degree or higher. Let's look at management consultant. So management, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience. And that's established by statement or professional credential attesting to 5 years of experience, either as a management consultant or in the field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So management consultants can qualify based on a degree or 5 years of work experience. So step one is to figure out what profession are you coming to the US to perform. And step two is to look at the qualifications in the regulations and make sure you satisfy those qualifications. Next on the list, you do need to have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. In other words, an employer in the US does need to make a job offer to you. You cannot get a TN visa to come to the US to look for a job. You actually already need the job offer in hand, again, to work in one of these listed professions. And finally, in that job that you're coming to the US to perform, you must be employed to engage in activities consistent with the profession. So what does this mean? This means if you, for example, let's say there's an employer in the US that really want someone to design their social media account, and you are really good at designing social media accounts and advertising on social media, etc. You are an expert at marketing, online marketing. Your undergraduate degree is in economics. So you and the employer have the idea, well, why don't I apply as a TN economist, and then I'll just come to the US and I'll create your Facebook page and Instagram, I'll design your Instagram feed, etc. That's going to be a problem. And that's going to be a problem because the government defines what an economist does. The government defines what each of these professions listed in the regulations does, and that definition can be found in what's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. It's published by the US Department of Labor. So if we look at OOH economist, and I'm just pulling this up as an example, but you can Google OOH economist. You click the tab at the top that says what they do, and you'll see a list of job duties. So economists research economic issues, conduct surveys, analyze data, they advise businesses, they present their research. So if you're coming to the US to help a company with its online marketing, those job duties do not fit within what an economist does, according to how the government defines it. So you need to make sure that you're coming to the US in one of the listed professions, that you qualify for that profession according to the regulations, and that you're coming to the US to perform job duties consistent with that profession. And again, the way you figure out what is consistent is you look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook for that specific profession. We'll talk about this a bit more later in the presentation, and we'll talk specifically about economists a bit more because that is a unique category, a uniquely challenging category in the TN context. One note that is very important is this final bullet that you see on your screen. The degree must match the job description. So what this means is if you are qualifying for a TN position, for a TN visa, based on a degree, the degree needs to be related to the profession. So let's continue with our economist example. If you remember, economists can only qualify for a TN visa based on their degree. They can't qualify based on experience. They can't qualify based on a professional certificate or license. They need to have a degree. So to take the example of economist, if you have an undergraduate degree in economics, that is clearly related. But what if your degree is in finance or math or statistics or English? You see how as you start getting farther and farther from economics, it becomes more and more tenuous, more and more risky. So if your degree is in finance, it may well be fine that the government may think that your degree is related to an economics degree. If your degree is in math or statistics, still, I think you may be able to make the argument that your degree is related to economics. But if your degree is in English, you are going to start facing some real risk of denial because it's not clear that that degree is related to economics in any way. What you would need to do if your degree is not a degree in economics is get into the actual coursework that was taken. So what we would oftentimes do is look at the transcript, look at our client's transcript. Did they, even though they studied, say, math or statistics or even English, look at what classes they took. Maybe you did take classes in economics. Maybe you did independent research on economics. Maybe you worked in a lab or for a professor and did research on economics. So again, I'm using the example of economists, but you could do a comparable example in any of these fields. So if you're qualifying for a TN based on the degree, you do want to make sure that degree is related. And if the degree is not related, you really do need to make some good arguments that you completed coursework and that your curriculum, the classes you took, the research you did was aligned with the profession. If you can't do that, you really are looking at a likely denial on a TN. And what that means really is you should consider other visa options. For example, an H-1B or an O-1 even as an example. So I've been referring to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. This is a screenshot of what that looks like. If you're at your computer, I recommend just Googling OOH and you see economist on your screen as the example. So OOH economist, the tab at the top that says what they do is where you'll see the job duties. Now, another helpful tab here is how to become one. So if you see that tab, it's to the right of what they do, how to become one. So this tab is helpful because it may actually help you in your argument if your degree is only distantly related to the field. So let's say you're applying as an economist, but your degree is not in economics. You may want to look at the language here. So education. Economists typically need a master's degree. To pursue an advanced degree, applicants may need to have completed undergraduate coursework in subjects such as economics or mathematics. So if your degree is in math and not economics, that's really helpful language for you, that the Occupational Outlook Handbook, the government's publication, is saying that an undergraduate degree in math may well qualify you for a role in economics. So candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or math may qualify for some economist positions. Again, really helpful language if your degree is, say, in statistics or math and not in economics. Again, if your degree is in English, you're going to face a real uphill battle. Might be better to look at other visa options. We'd be happy to talk with you about what those options are. But if you do have a degree that is somewhat related, it's helpful to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook in case it has helpful language for you. So sponsorship. We have a whole slide dedicated to this, and the title of this webinar is, Does a TN require sponsorship? Because it's one of the most common questions we get about the TN visa. And the first thing that's important to clarify is what sponsorship is. In the context of US immigration law, sponsorship is really when an employer is has a number of obligations toward the foreign worker that is applying for the visa, or the employer is applying for the visa on behalf of the foreign worker. So those responsibilities, and I'll just quickly say, none of these responsibilities apply to the TN. So the short answer to the question is the TN does not require sponsorship. That is the short answer to the question. But why do I say that? Because in US immigration law, sponsorship is things such as the employer needing to pay a prevailing wage, for example, which is higher than minimum wage. The employer needing to pay for the workers' return transportation to their home country. The employer really being responsible for a number of aspects of the worker's employment. Sometimes it includes the employer testing the US labor market. So seeing if there's a US worker, advertising the job, interviewing US candidates, seeing if they're a fit. And if they are, you need to withdraw the job posting. None of that applies to the TN. So a TN employer does not need to test the US labor market. They don't need to see if there's a US worker willing and able to do the job. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage. They do need to pay minimum wage, as does any employer, generally speaking, in the US, but they don't need to pay a prevailing wage. So there really is no heightened requirement on the employer beyond what an employer has to do for any other worker. Okay. And that's important because a lot of employers are confused about this. A lot of employers do think that a TN requires sponsorship. They think any visa in the US requires sponsorship by the employer, and that's not the case. We have videos on this on our YouTube channel. We're happy to have consultations with employers to explain this to them. There really is a lot of confusion about this. So, what are the requirements on the employer then? Basically, what the employer needs to do is make a job offer to the foreign worker, the prospective employee. They need to put that offer in writing in the form of a letter, and we'll talk about that letter later in the presentation. And the letter's basically going to explain who they are as the employer, who the employee is, what the job duties are, how much they plan to pay the person, how long they plan to employ the person, things like that. It's a letter of about 2 to 3 pages, and that is what the visa applicant, the TN applicant, will bring with them either to the consulate or the port of entry to get the TN visa or status. The employer just needs to sign that letter. It does, obviously, it needs to be honest. It needs to be accurate, an accurate representation of what the employer plans to do. They plan to pay this much. They plan to employ the employee for a certain period of time. But this is an at-will employee. So if this worker comes into the US and it just doesn't work out, the employee can quit. They would have to leave, but they can quit, or the employee can be fired. So the employer is under no obligation to continue employing the employee if it just doesn't work out. So this is why I say there really are no heightened requirements as there would be if there were truly sponsorship required here. You see on your screen there's a distinction between filing for a TN at a port of entry or a consulate versus filing from within the United States with USCIS. We'll talk more about how a TN application is filed, but the reason this is on this screen is that if the TN, the employee who's applying for a TN, is inside the US, they have the option of applying for TN status through US Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. If that application is filed with USCIS, it is the employer that files the application. This does not, again, this does not add any additional responsibilities on the employer. What it does mean, though, is that the employer does need to sign the forms that are submitted to USCIS. It's an I-129 form, and it would be in the employer's name, the application. But again, there is no heightened prevailing wage required. The employer doesn't need to test the labor market, etc. Contrast that to If the employee is applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, then it is the employee that is submitting the application. This is something of a technicality, but it does mean something. So what it means is that if a TN application is denied by USCIS, it is the employer that is being denied. If a TN application is being denied by a port of entry or a consulate, it is the employee's application that is being denied. So on future visa applications, if that individual is filing a visa application, they would need to answer, has your visa application been denied in the past? If the application was with USCIS and was denied, that is the employer's application that was denied. So the employee would not have to say that that was their denial. If they're applying at a consulate or a port of entry, however, it is the employee's denial. They would have to disclose that denial. So again, something of a technicality, but does change how the representations that you would make to the government. So let's talk a little bit more about something I've hinted at, which is that you do have different options for applying for a TN visa. There are really three options. Two of those options are available to nationals of Mexico. All three of those options are available to nationals of Canada. So nationals of Mexico and Canada can apply at a consulate. To do that, they would file a form DS-160. It's an online form. It would go to the consulate. When the consulate is ready, they would call the person in for an interview. The person would go, and if they're approved, would receive a TN visa actually in their passport. It's a sticker that the consulate will put in your passport. It'll say how long the visa is valid for and who you have authorization to work for on the TN visa. And with that, you can enter and exit the US in TN status as long as the visa is valid. That's the consular option. Again, that's available to nationals of Canada or Mexico. The other option that's available to nationals of Canada and Mexico is to apply from within the US through USCIS. This is available only if you're inside the US. So if you're Canadian and inside the USA as a student, or if you're a national of Mexico inside the US as a student, and you get a job offer from an employer, the employer can file for a change of status to TN status. And again, that application would be filed by the employer. Once it's approved, the individual would get a new I-94, which is the document that defines how long you can stay in the US and in what status. And once that period is valid, once the start date has begun, you're in TN status and you can work for the TN employer. Again, that option is also available to Canadians and Mexicans. The option that is not available to nationals of Mexico is to apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Canada do have this option, and it is very easy. It is almost always how nationals of Canada will apply for TN status, just because it is so fast, it's cheap, which is to apply either at a land crossing or at an airport. If you are approved, if you apply this way and you're approved, you basically would be allowed to enter the US. Oftentimes they'll put a stamp in your passport and say that for the next 3 years, you can enter the US, enter and exit the US, working for the specific employer in question. So let's talk about some particular TN visa categories. So if you remember before, the TN regulations list dozens of professions, from accountants to economists, veterinarians. Not all of them are created equal. So some are more difficult than others. And two categories that are particularly challenging are management consultant and economists. So let's talk about each of these two. These are challenging for different reasons. The management consultant category is challenging because it is one of the few categories that does not require a degree. You can qualify as a management consultant based on experience alone. And again, that is 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in the field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So if you are applying for a TN and you don't have a degree, you're probably going to only be eligible for the management consulting category. Even if the work you're going to be doing is not related to management consulting, this is going to be the only category you can possibly apply for based on the lack of a degree. And the government knows this. They know that people are funneled into the management consulting category simply because they don't have a degree, even if they're not really planning to work as a management consultant. So this category is heavily scrutinized. One thing I will say, a couple points on this. The first thing that's important to clarify is not all management consultant TN applications are especially challenging. If you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, Oliver Wyman, there are many consulting firms. If you're coming to the US to work at a consulting firm and you qualify based on a degree or your experience, that's not a uniquely challenging application. Where this is challenging is if you're coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. The example I like to give is if you are an expert in solar panels, manufacturing solar panels, and you're a national of Mexico, you've been working in the solar panel industry for 5 years, and a company in the US wants to hire you to advise them on how to improve their manufacturing or their marketing, whatever it is related to solar panels, that would be a challenging application. And the reason is the US employer is not a management consulting firm. It's a solar panel company. You would qualify because you have 5 years of experience that's related to the consulting agreement, but that application would be scrutinized. So how do you strengthen a management consulting application? There are a few things that are really important to keep in mind. And I would say that the overarching piece of advice is, and thing to keep in mind, you really do want the employer relationship, the engagement, to look like what the government thinks a management consulting arrangement looks like. So if you, and again, this needs to be a reflection of reality. So you wouldn't just do this to get an approval. You really do need to make sure this is the way that the arrangement is in reality. What I mean by the engagement reflecting a management consulting arrangement is a company does not hire a management consultant to fill a full-time role. A company hires a management consultant to come in and address a specific problem that the company is facing. And that management consultant is going to specifically look at that problem, analyze the problem, give advice on the problem, maybe monitor as changes are implemented, and then they're going to leave. They're not a W-2 employee. They're typically an independent contractor. They're paid based on deliverables like research they're producing, recommendations they give. That is what a consulting agreement looks like. So if you are applying as a management consultant and you're going to be a W-2 employee for 3 years and you're going to fill a permanent role at this company in the US, that is very likely going to be denied because the government's going to look at it and think, this isn't a management consultant arrangement. You're not consulting, you're filling a full-time role. So a TN application for a management consultant, again, if the employer is not a management consulting firm, should, for example, define the specific challenge that the management consultant is going to advise on, explain how the management consultant is qualified to advise on that challenge. Oftentimes, there will be a consulting agreement that defines what the deliverables are. So in months 1 through 3, the management consultant is going to analyze this. In months 4 through 6, they are going to present their findings. Months 7 through 9, they're going to monitor changes that are implemented. And they're going to be paid according to that. That is what the application should look like. Again, because that is what a management consulting arrangement tends to look like. So These are very tricky applications, TN management consultant applications. We do generally recommend that you hire a lawyer to walk through these applications. And again, I do want to be clear, if you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm as a management consultant, in those cases, it is okay if you're a W-2 employee because you're not being hired out to a company. So I do want to make that clear. The second category that is challenging is that of economists. And the reason that this category is challenging is because the government put out a policy memo in 2017 that narrowed what the government thinks that economists do. Before 2017, people were coming into the US to work as economists, but in fact, they were acting as financial analysts and market research analysts. And the government ended up saying, you know what? We don't think financial analysts and market research analysts should be eligible under the economist category. So let's define what financial analysts and market research analysts do. Financial analysts basically work for a company and find ways to increase profits through investments. So they would work, say, at a bank, and they would figure out, the bank has capital and needs to invest it. Financial analysts will look and figure out where investment should be made to maximize profits. Market research analysts are analyzing how companies can improve their marketing. So if you think of someone who's working in marketing, that is what market research analysts do. So again, if you're coming to the US to work either as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, the TN economist category is not going to be a good fit. You can, and I do recommend that you go to Occupational Outlook Handbook and go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and search for financial analysts or market research analysts, and you'll see what job duties they do. Again, those are not permitted under the economist category. In contrast, you do want to look at what the economist category, what the government thinks they do according to the OOH. And we looked at these before, but they research economic issues, conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data. They interpret trends such as of financial markets, and they advise businesses and clients, governments, et cetera. So if you're coming to the US to work as an economist, you really do want to make sure your job duties are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says economists do. So what is the TN application process? So as I mentioned before, there are three options. Let's start with the easiest one, which is only available to Canadians, which is to apply at a port of entry. Basically, the national of Canada will leave the United States if they're in the United States. If they're not in the United States, they would enter through either a land crossing or an airport. And they would provide to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the border officer, their TN application. And they would say, I'm applying to enter in TN status to work for a US employer. Here are my materials. What would those materials be? So there are a few key parts to a TN application. The first is a letter from the US employer. And that letter is going to explain who the US employer is, why they need someone in this role, who the foreign prospective employee is, how they qualify, so whether a degree, experience, or professional license, how much the US employer plans to pay the person. Now, even though there is no requirement to pay above minimum wage, it is a good idea for the salary to reflect the market rate for that role. If you have, for example, a job offer to work as a lawyer for a US employer and you're being paid minimum wage, that is going to look very strange. So the border officer is going to ask, are you actually going to be doing what you say you're doing? And if so, why aren't you actually being compensated as a lawyer? So you do want to make sure that the pay reflects the job. You also, the letter should also say how long the U.S. employer plans to employ the employee. The maximum period of time for a TN is 3 years for Canadians, 4 years for nationals of Mexico. And again, there's no obligation for the employer to actually employ the person for that period of time. It can be, you can in the letter put a shorter period of time. For management consultants, it's recommended that the period be shorter if they're coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. But the employer should put the intended period when they plan to employ the US worker. So that's the first thing, is the employer letter. It needs to have an original signature from the employer, and it also needs to have the employer's contact information. The second piece of information is documentation showing how you qualify. So if you're qualifying based on a degree, you need to bring that degree with you, the actual degree, not a copy. If your degree is related, but you need to go show that through your coursework, bring certified copies of your transcripts. If you're qualifying based on a professional license, bring the actual license, the original of the license. And if you're qualifying based on experience, you want to bring letters from past employers that have original signatures talking about your experience in that profession. So the second category of documentation is proof of how you qualify. Of course, you also do want to bring your passport. And some people, if they are applying for a TN for the third or fourth time, if they've had one for several years, it might be good to also have documentation showing your ties to your home country, so to Canada or Mexico, such as bank account statements, proof that you have property there, just in case the government has questions about your intention to return after the end of your TN visa. So that is how to apply at a port of entry. I do want to quickly say some ports of entry are optimized for TN processing. So it's always a good idea to call beforehand, see if there is a specific procedure in place at that port of entry. If you're applying at a consulate, so again, nationals of Canada or Mexico can apply at a consulate. Really the only reason or the typical reason why a Canadian would apply at a consulate is if they have a dependent spouse or child who's not a national of Canada. If that's the case, then the dependent would need to apply at a consulate. And so oftentimes the principal applicant would also apply at the consulate. Otherwise, Canadians very rarely will get a TN visa at the consulate. Nationals of Mexico will usually get their TN visa at a consulate. So the process is slightly different from a port of entry. You do need to file the DS-160 online with the consulate. The consulate will then schedule your biometrics, your fingerprints, and schedule an interview with you. After you attend the interview, the consulate will keep your passport for a few days and put the TN visa in your passport. And then once you have your passport back, you'll be able to enter the US in TN status. Some people qualify for renewals by mail at the consulates in Mexico. The consulates will let you know if you qualify, so that's not something you apply for. They'll let you know once they receive your application. The application packet will be essentially identical to what I described before, though, other than the DS-160. What you'll bring with you to the consulate is that employer letter, proof that you qualify, your passport, proof of ties to your home country. And finally, the third option, again available to nationals of Mexico and Canada, is applying with USCIS. So you do need to be inside the US to do this. The employer would file the Form I-129 and would include supporting documents that I described before, the employer letter, proof of qualification. Those will be copies, though. If they go to USCIS does not want to get original documents, so you would file copies with USCIS. So let's talk about some tips and common pitfalls. I've already touched on a few of these. It's a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry before you go, just to make sure you're aware of what hours they're open, if there are any unique procedures that you need to follow, and if they're optimized for TN processing. It is a good idea to make sure that the person who signs the employer letter, so the employer contact who signed the letter, make sure they are available when you are having your interview, either with CBP, Customs and Border Protection, or at the consulate. And this is because sometimes the government officer will pick up the phone and call them just to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. Border officials and consular officers encounter a lot of fraud. So they encounter a lot of fake documents, and they're very sensitive to that. That's why we always recommend that you bring originals with original signatures of the employer letter, of the experience letters, if you're applying based on experience, original diplomas, original transcripts, certified copies of transcripts, no copies at the consulates or the ports of entry. And again, do touch base with your employer to just make sure they have their phone on them. Let them know, I plan to enter the US between, say, 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock tomorrow. Could you just keep your phone on you in case the government calls? They don't usually do that, but if they do, it's good to be prepared. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. That means it does not lead to a green card. It is not a green card. You do need to convince the government that you plan to leave, that you see your stay as temporary. This is usually not an issue at all for the first 1 or 2 times that you have a TN. Once you get into, say, year 6, 7, 8 of being on a TN, you might start getting questions about your intention to leave. So it's a good idea, regardless, to just have documents showing your ties to Canada or Mexico, just in case they ask. All right, and we have received a couple questions. And feel free to send in more questions as I'm going through these. We do have a bit of time. Can we move from a TN visa to an H1 visa while staying and working in the US on a TN visa? The answer is you can. You can change status from TN status to, say, H1B status. You would apply for a change of status with USCIS. And once your H-1B is approved for a new employer, you would need to stop working for the current TN employer. That is very important. And related to this is that you can work on a TN part-time. You can have a TN for more than one employer. The important thing to know is that you do need approval for each TN employer. So let's say you're working part-time for 2 TN employers. You do need to wait till you have approval from the government for both. So if you come in working for one TN employer and another employer approaches you and says, hey, could you work for us part-time in addition to your current work? You cannot just start working for them. You need to let the government know that you're going to be working for 2 TN employers. And once they approve that, you can work for both. All right. If the employer offers a full-time job, what time period should be mentioned? So if it's a full-time job and we're offering a 3-year period, if it's a full-time job, I mean, the number of years is just doesn't depend on whether it's full or part-time. Full or part-time really has nothing to do with whether you ask for 1 year or 3 years. What decides that is what the employer needs. So if they need a full-time employee, have a full-time employee. If they need a part-time employee, have part-time. If it is a concurrent employment arrangement where there's 2 TN employers, you're probably not going to apply full-time for both. That would probably raise questions. And in terms of whether you ask for 1 year or 3, again, it really needs to depend on the engagement. So what does the employer need? If they only need someone for a year, the application should only ask for a year. If it's a management consultant application, it should probably be for a year, maybe 2 years. But again, the idea of management consultant is you come in, you address an issue, and you leave. Again, management consultant for a company in the US, that's not a management consulting firm. If you are coming to work as a management consultant for a management consulting firm, it is fine to ask for 3 years because you're a full-time employee for that management consulting firm. Do we raise any flags if we keep renewing the TN visa? The answer is no. As long as you remain eligible, meaning you're working in your occupation, the employer continues to need you to perform the job duties that are defined in the Occupational Outlook Handbook for your profession, it doesn't raise flags to keep renewing the TN. You might get questions about, do you intend to leave at the end of your current stay? And that is usually not difficult to address. You would just explain, look, I'm not applying for a green card. I have left on time always in the past. I've never overstayed. And you can bring documentation showing your ties to Canada or Mexico, whether that's bank accounts that have a balance in those countries, or a lease agreement, or if you own property, mortgage payments, things like that. You think about what you can show the officer to prove your ties to your home country. But the answer is no. There's no limit on the number of times you can renew a TN visa as long as you remain eligible. All right, I think that is all of the questions. If you would like to discuss the specific circumstances of your situation, whether the TN is a good option, we would be happy to talk with you over a consultation. So keep an eye out for that email that we'll send you, which has this presentation, the PowerPoint presentation. We'll also include a guide on the TN visa in that email, and it'll have our contact information for a consultation. So we do hope to see you on future webinars. Please do reach out if we can be helpful at any point along the way. Thank you for taking the time. Have a good day.